This past week, I've been, on Friday, I was working on some stuff for Wednesday night. And while I was reading some material, the Lord just kind of spoke to me that that's what you need to speak on for Sunday. Okay. I really don't think I need to do that, but he kind of told me, yes, I do. So I kind of found that it's best to say, yes, sir. Kind of like the song, we bow down, right? Phil gave me a t-shirt a number of years ago, and I've worn it a lot and get a lot of comments when I go places. It states on there, on the t-shirt, it says, live your life in such a way that the preacher doesn't have to lie at your funeral. And it's an interesting one. I get a lot of comments when people see it. And I think, you stop and think about it. When you do a funeral, as I've done a few of them, you want to commemorate, and you want to comfort, and you want to challenge. That's where you speak of the person, and you speak of their good traits and things that they have. Obviously, there's always traits that all of us have that people could bring up that may not be the most desirable. Well, we don't bring those up at a funeral. But I think one thing it is interesting when we bring it up, how many times when we're speaking about a person, is it just their life here and the good things they've done in this life, talking about the living for the died, and how many of it is doing things they're living for the line when we bring them up at the funeral. And so I think it's an interesting statement when you look at it. And I was reading about a person, maybe you've heard of him, I'll give it to you here in a minute. It's kind of an interesting deal. But if I gave each of you, almost did, bring a piece of paper, handed it to every one of you, and asked you to write your own obituary, what you wished it would be, what would you put out? Because it's an interesting statement. What do you want to be your own obituary to be read? And if that's the case, what are you going to do to where that becomes a reality? Because we can, if that's what we want, and some people are wanting different ones. The reason I said that, I was reading about, maybe you've heard of him, a man by the name of Alfred. Alfred lived in the late 1800s. And he actually invented dynamite and made a tremendous amount of money. Became a millionaire when he invented dynamite. And his brother, he lived in Switzerland. He was a Swiss chemist. His brother lived in France. And his brother's name was Ludwig. And Ludwig died, and there's a French newspaper. The French newspaper got it messed up. And they wrote that Alfred had died. So Alfred was reading what they wrote about him. And this is what the headline said: "The merchant of death is dead." And it really shook Alfred up. And it goes on to talk about how he had made millions of dollars inventing things to kill people. So he decided that he wanted to change his legacy. And so he died 8 years later, and he had given away and set up things to give away to help people into doing good deeds for other things. And he gave $9 million. If you think about it, that many years ago, how much money that would be. What was Alfred's last name? Nobel Peace Prize. Now, how many of us think of Dr. Death when we think of Nobel Peace Prize? Okay. Did he change it in 8 years? What about Scrooge? Did he change his legacy? What about Zacchaeus? Did he change his legacy? So you think about it, we can do it, but there's going to be things that we're going to have to do in order to get there. So first of all, I want to think about it, just give you about 4 or 5 things, what we can do to get where I believe we would like to be when we do that. And the first one I think you can find when you think of, when you look over in Philippians chapter 2, we saw it last week, but we can see it again. Philippians chapter 2, and you notice in verse 3 down to verse 5, much easier said than done, but notice in chapter 2, it says, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, which would be vainglory, but with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself. Do not merely look at your own interests, but also the interests of others. Have this attitude in yourself, which was also in Christ Jesus. So the first step I think you have is others. How many of us are thinking of others? If you remember in Mark chapter 10, verse 35 to 45, you remember there was a debate. And James and John's mother comes to Jesus and says, I want my 2 sons to sit on your right and on your left. And according to Scripture, what do the other 10 do? There you go. They got mad because they hadn't thought of it, and they want to be on his right. And then Jesus goes on then in the text. He says, that's not for me to give, but don't be like the world in which you lord it over them. The greatest of you is he who what? Serves. Then you get to verse 45, the theme of the book of Mark, the Son of Man gave his life a ransom for what? For many. So think about it. How many of us do we want to really, in our obituary, thinking of others? And when you think about it, when you go to most of the funeral, how many times when you hear the things that are being said, is it what the individual did for other people? So often is what they did for other people. I love watching the different ball games, and you see the big guys, the 300-pound guys, and he's saying what? I love you, Mom, right? Because of the service that the mother had done growing up or whatever. But thinking about that of others, and I think it's an interesting deal. You have, like you said, in the Christmas Carol, have you ever looked at the very end of the Christmas Carol and what Scrooge actually says at the end of it? It's a quote, I'll give it to you, because it's kind of an interesting statement what he says. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and a little heated them. His own heart laughed, and it was quite enough for him. It was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. Quite a change. People will laugh. You do make a change, and if you do put others first, you will have people laugh at you because the world will say that's not how you do it. So just be prepared. If you want the epitaph that you want, there will be people who will laugh at you. But I think one thing, if you think about it, is that to put others first, I want you to think about it, and that's this. Whose shoes can you walk in this week? Whose shoes can you walk in this week? You ever stopped and try to walk in somebody else's shoes? Because when you do, you'll have empathy for them and you think of a lot of things. And I'm going to pick on them. They don't know I'm going to, so it's easier to ask for forgiveness and permission. You think about it with Glenn and Geraldine when they came back from the mission field, and I've seen this with my sister and others. You spend 20 years or more on the mission field and you come back, and how much money do you have to put down on a house? None. So what happens when you come back at the age that they are when they come back, most of us have already had our starter home, and what happens? We sell it, we have the equity, we can go on to the next one. Well then what easily you stop and you think about walking a mile in their shoes. What kind of money do they have for a down payment? So when you start thinking about it, walk in somebody else's shoes and you'll have a better understanding on anything that they do. And so do that with all of them, no matter where they're at. Just, walk a mile in their shoes for a little while. And do that with every person in the room. Just think about it, I'll give you an example. I had a person work for me, Terry. He was a minister of a large church staff. And he was in between church staffs, and he came to work for me. He worked for me for 6 months, mowing yards every day in the heat of the summer. And I'll never forget one of the mistakes. We'd meet once a week before we'd mow, and we'd meet at 36th and Yale. There's a park there, and we'd have breakfast together, and we'd pray, and then we'd go to work. And I'll never forget him making a statement. He goes, I understand for the first time in my life, when we would get upset as a ministerial staff, when people wouldn't stay late and would get upset with us holding our meetings late into the evening. He said, when you have to get up and go to work in this hot sun, working around this equipment, and you're that tired on Monday morning, it is dangerous. And I can see why you shouldn't be keeping people that late who have to work the next day. But he didn't learn that until what? Until he started doing it. And so I think it's important for all of us. My bosses of different times have said they wanted to get out and trade places for a while. I think it's one of the best things they could do for all of us. Do somebody else's job for a while and you realize it's not near as easy as what you think. So get out and try it. So the first thing when you're writing your own obituary, just think of others and walk in their shoes, because you will now have a new understanding, a new appreciation, and you then can give them the compliments and so on that they deserve. Second thing, look over in Galatians chapter 2. Excuse me, Galatians chapter 6. In Galatians chapter 6, you'll notice in verse 9, it's talking about giving, but it's an interesting statement in verse 9 and 10. Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we shall reap if we do not grow weary. So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all men, especially to those who are of the household of faith. The second thing besides others is that opportunity. How many of us are taking the opportunity? Because you have an opportunity today, it doesn't mean you're going to have the opportunity tomorrow or down the road. How many of you have ever had some opportunities to say things or do things and you didn't? And the opportunity in the window closed. We're all facing that, so stop and think of the opportunity for what you would do. For that obituary to be the way it is, seize the opportunity today, otherwise it may not be there tomorrow. Another example of this is over in 2 Corinthians. We've seen this before, chapter 8. Let's go ahead and turn over there for a moment, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And if you know the one in 2 Corinthians, the Jerusalem church sent leaders and they helped the Corinthian church spiritually. The Jerusalem church is now hurting financially because of the famine. And so notice in verse 14 and 15, it makes the statement, at this present time your abundance being a supply for their want. The Corinthians had an abundance so far as material things. The Jewish church did not. Their want, that their abundance also may become a supply to your want, that there be equality. And it's written, he who has gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little had no lack. Why you have an opportunity? Some of us have financial resources we can help today. Doesn't mean we'll have them tomorrow. Some of us have time today that we will not necessarily have tomorrow. Some of us have the mental capacities today we may not have tomorrow. So one is helping be thinking of others. The two is seizing the opportunity that you have today. Because its window is closing. You get that other, go over to Colossians for a moment. You'll have the same thing talking about opportunities. In Colossians chapter 4, it's an interesting statement that you have. Colossians chapter 4, Paul's writing, think about it, he's writing from prison. And in chapter 4, he asks in verse 2 to 4 that they pray for him that he'll speak like he should. And then notice in verse 5, conduct yourself with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. The word for making the most is actually the Greek word buy up. Buy up your opportunity. How often do we have that opportunity? How many of you, if you're like me, you finish and later in the day or whatever, a week later, you think, man, that was a good opportunity, I missed it. But how many of us prayed at the beginning of the day that we'd see the opportunity when it was there? Paul was asking for prayer beforehand. I think it's part of why we miss the opportunities, because we're not praying before the opportunity comes, therefore we miss it. And he goes on, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned as it were with salt, so that you may know how to respond to each person. There's no pat answer. Yes, there are truths, but how to relate that truth to each individual is going to need to be personalized. So thinking about seizing that opportunity. How many of you like to stop and think about it? We'll make the commitment that this week I'm going to pray each day that I'll see and seize the opportunities. Each week I'm going to pray that I'll see it and I'm going to seize it. Because I think what happens if we did that, we'll see a lot more of it. I'll never forget, it's been a number of years ago when Kay made a statement to me, why aren't you talking about it had to do with wildlife and eagles and things like that? And said, well, why don't you, in so many words, why aren't you noticing it? And I'm thinking sunrise or whatever, well, why am I not noticing it? I'm driving right by, why not go out look? Well, Jean called, it was kind of funny, she called, she was in Jinx this week, and She called, she was all excited, she was out with a friend, and she was, man, guess what we saw? I said, I don't know. We saw a bald eagle flying out over. And my response was, I see that every day. Because what comes, it is true. Where I am, I see them all the time. But so one person can see something, it's not that big a deal. But for somebody else, that's tremendous. But how many of us are seizing the opportunity to stop and look at the beauty of what God's created? So think about it. When you think about that opportunity, just pray, Lord, will show it to me. I'm going to walk them a mile in somebody else's shoes. But then secondly, I'm going to pray and seize the opportunity when it comes. The third thing I want you to look over in Galatians chapter 1. Galatians chapter 1, notice in verse 10, Paul's speaking and he's writing to the Galatians. And notice what it says, for am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I were still striving to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. The third thing when it talks about the obituary, whose approval and what audience are we performing for? You think about it, how many of our presidents and our different things we have to have a library named after them. We have a lot of different things. But whose audience are they striving for? I've often got irritated, whether it be my own graduations or my kids, and I listen to some of the speakers. I went to one a couple of years ago when Jesse and Ruthie and this speaker, and you were wondering who he was speaking to because all he had to say was about his accomplishments. And his whole time he was speaking about what all he had done, and he obviously is a very famous individual and done so much for a lot of things for our country. But he had only a couple of things that were said to the graduates. The rest of his whole speech had to do with himself. And I think it's important for us to recognize when we're going there to speak or anything else, who are we speaking to? We're speaking to the graduates. We're not speaking about ourselves. And it's like when I do a wedding. People don't come to hear me speak. They don't. They're coming for one reason. They're coming to see the people get married. So you don't have to make it long because they're going to remember what you said anyway. They don't really come to hear you speak. They really don't. So I think it's important when you think about our audience and our approval, when we go to do things, whose audience are we trying to do and whose approval do we want? And you can get approval in this life as well as in the next. But you have to think of who you're trying to go for it. You stop and you think about it. That's why in Peter in Acts chapter 5, remember they told him to be quiet. In verse 29, he says, I must obey what? God rather than man. There comes a time when that's the case. Are we going to approve, and do you want the approval of men today, certain situations, or do I want approval of God tomorrow? So I think it's interesting. You think, how do you do it? We've seen this before in 1 Corinthians 3. We're all building. We're building on a foundation of Christ. We should be. We can do it either with wood, hay, and stone, or we can do it with the fine metals. And you tell me, how do you distinguish? In chapter 4, in verse 5, it makes the distinction. It says, for what is your motive? What is your motive? You can do, and all of us can do a lot of good things, but it's for the wrong motive. Therefore, it's going to be burned up. But you and I can't tell the motive. I can't tell somebody's motive. They can fake me out real well. But God knows the motive. So you think about the audience that you have, realize that we have a judge that knows our motive. He knows what's going on inside. You can do a lot. You can cook things and you can do all kinds of things. But are you doing it to show off how good a cook you are? Or are you doing it in which to help the individual? We can all do that. We can sing, we can speak, we can do anything. Is it to show how good I am, or to bring glory to the Lord and serve somebody? So think about what we've done so far. What about others? Am I willing to walk a mile in their shoes? The opportunity, am I willing to pray and then seize the opportunity? When you think about the approval in the audience, it reminds me of a story that I read a number of years ago. I've shared it with you before. It has to do with the missionaries. A couple had been on the field in Africa for 50 years, and they were coming back to England. And they come back, and the ship, and obviously the money that they had, they would not be kind of like today, flying on a plane, first class versus second class. Who gets off first? First class. So when they come up to the port in England, they recognize they have all these banners, welcome home, and all this other stuff. And they got so excited that they thought people were welcome home. The crowd was everywhere. Well, it took them so long to get off that when they got off, the banners and all the people were gone. And the husband was real disappointed, and they found out why. Because a dignitary was coming back from France, and they were welcoming home. And the wife turned to the husband and said, honey, we're not home yet. And there's a lot of truth to that. But so often we come home, and you same thing, you spend the time, and you all of a sudden you do things, and it's just like, there's no fanfare, there's not any big, and you have all this difficulty. So think about it. Who do I want to hear well done from? Who do I want to hear welcome home? You know, you have it. You can hear well done today. You can hear well done from our Heavenly Father for eternity. So think about it. Whose approval do you want, and in what audience? Fourth thing I want to think about a little bit about has to do with the line and the dot, and we've looked at it. We'll look at it again. Look at two of them, Hebrews 10 and Hebrews 11. And I'm going to give you some quotes of some individuals who I've greatly admired in my life, read a lot about different ones. Hebrews chapter 10, and it talks about some of the things that some of the men and women of faith had happened to them before. And you'll notice in verse 34, it said, for you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property. It's amazing. How many of you would joyfully accept the seizure of your property? Or we would say, you'll get it after you pry my dead fingers off my gun, right? Isn't that what we usually read? Knowing that you yourselves have a what? A better possession and an abiding one. They were looking for what? I lost what I earned and worked for here, but I'm going to get a better one there. Line in the dot. Same thing happens in Hebrews 11, talking about Moses in verse, you think about it, in talking about verse into 25, the passing pleasures of sin, talking about the stuff of Egypt, concerning the reproach of Christ, greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, looking to the reward. You think about it, we've seen King Tut's tomb. That's a lot of riches. But it's amazing, we say King Tut's riches, were they his riches? Or the riches of his people that he took from him? We attribute it to him, but as a young man at the age that he was, they weren't his riches. He took it from somebody else, and they are still sitting there, and he's never enjoyed it. But Moses is already enjoying the riches in heaven, and he will be rejoicing in heaven for eternity. So think about the line or the dot part of it. Let me give you some quotes of some. Let me turn this thing on. I use this other one to talk loud. I see some of you. Only good thing about it, I see some of you fringing and everything else is keeping you awake. Let me give you some people I've greatly admired and some of the quotes they have, and look and listen to their. This is kind of how they were able to. We hear about them, and even though they've died many, many years ago, this is what made them who they are because of their philosophy of life. What's your philosophy of life? This is John Wesley. I judge all things only by the price they shall gain in eternity. So everything he's looking at, just like when his house burned, what did he make the statement? That's one less thing I have to worry about is the Lord. C.T. Studd, I remember as a kid I greatly admired him. He's considered the greatest cricket player ever to play cricket in England. And he went and became a missionary and gave it up. This is what he said: only one life and it will soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. That was his philosophy, and obviously he did well. Jim Elliot, he is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. How about William Borden? How many of you know who he is? William Borden? This was on his epitaph, which is just outside, it's in Egypt, just outside off of a road. And on his epitaph, this is actually etched into stone. Apart from Christ, there's no explanation for such a life. I've read a lot of different epitaphs. I've read one that says, "You know where I am," and the wife made the statement, "I know where you are tonight." It's no kidding. It's actually etched in stone. Obviously, they didn't have a very good relationship. But notice, if you notice anything about William Borden, he had 3 things he wrote in his Bible. 3 major things, and that's basically what got him where he is. He was a multimillionaire. He obviously went to an Ivy League school, did very, very well. His parents were very wealthy. He decided not to follow after his parents, gave away everything that he had, and then his dad said, "Well, you're not going to be part of the company." So he wrote in his Bible, "No reserves." He has nothing to go because the dad's not giving anything. Went on then, and he continued, and his dad realized it was going to be reality. His dad came back a little bit later and said, "You can never come back to the company." And William Borden wrote in his Bible, "No retreat." Because had he gone back home and said, "Dad, I'm sorry," what would have happened? He would have been admitted and brought back in after, maybe a little bit. When he then caught the disease and died after only 4 months in Egypt, he then wrote this just before he died, and his mom then gave it to the rest of us, "No regrets." If you think about it, is that not 3 statements we could all say? And no reserves, no retreats, no regrets. And I'm sure that if I asked Tommy and if I asked Kay, would Sarah say the same thing? No question. And that's why they are where they are and why they have the obituary, and they're going to hear "well done" one day. But what about you and I? You think about it, others, opportunity, approval, the line in the dot. You think about it, Robert Moffat, which I have a quote, it's sitting on my desk in the other room. This is what he has. "We should have all eternity with which to celebrate our victories, but we only have 1 swift hour before the sunset in which to win them." For some of us, that sunset's getting pretty close. And I'm only talking about the opportunity. We don't have much of it. So stop and think about it. Let's give you those then for others. Whose shoes can I fill this week? Whose shoes can I just switch places and be them this week? And think about what they're going through and they're difficult, because then we can pray for them better. We can call them. We can encourage it, whatever it might be. What about opportunities? Will I pray this week for an opportunity and then seize it when it becomes available? That's one reason why next week the Voice of the Martyrs will be here. They're going to be here for the Sunday school class for the whole hour. Those that want the Sunday school classes that want to join Ken. And then he'll be here for the inspiration, unless he wants to speak, but that'd be up to him. But he's just going to be basically explaining what they do, and just another possibility of an opportunity for you to do something, whether it's stuff in envelopes, whether it's praying for them, whatever it might be. We're just giving all these opportunities out there so that when you all see it, the Lord speaks to one of your heart and say, "That's what I want to do." And I don't know what that'll be. What about the approval? Who do you want to hear "well done" from? How many of you, no matter what your age is, still want to hear approval from your parents? Well, how many of us want to hear approval from our Heavenly Father? And then what's it going to take to get it? And then what's your life motto? What's your life motto? I think it's interesting. I just read you a few of the men who we greatly admire. What is our life motto? And if you don't have one, you're sure to hit it. And I think that's where a lot of us are. I think that's where a lot of us are. I think that's where a lot of us are. I think that's where a lot of us are.